I want to thank the organizer of the symposium for giving us the opportunity to present work on electron backscatter diffraction in additive materials. By way of introduction, I'm Stuart Wright. I've been involved with EBSD since 1987, using the first system in North America. And my colleague Matt Now has also been working in EBSD for quite some time, having joined in with our group in 1999. Having said that, we are very experienced in EBSD, but we are not experts in additive manufacturing by any means, and we'll be relying on some of the work of other colleagues, David Rohnhorst at NRL, Josh Kasher and Surya Kaladindi at Georgia Tech, and Ashley Spear at the University of Utah. Our outline is going to be as follows. We'll do a brief introduction to EBSD. I'm hoping and assuming most of you are familiar with EBSD at this point, as it has been around for quite some time now. Then we'll talk a little bit about using EBSD to characterize grain shape, residual strain, and as well as elastic stress and strain. And we're going to look at something in terms of parent grain reconstruction, which I'll explain in more detail later. And also then get to the aspects of microstructural design, which I think is a real exciting area for additive manufacturing and EBSD together. So EBSD is done in this scanning electron microscope. When the electron beam is focused on a grain in the microstructure, you get a diffraction pattern that looks like you see there on a phosphor screen. It is captured with a low-light CCD, or today more commonly CMOS cameras. And the bands in that pattern reflect, they represent reflecting planes in the volume, in the interaction volume in the diffracting crystal. And so the arrangement of those bands tells us something about the orientation of the crystal as well as the phase. And just as an example, as I put the beam on one grain, I get a pattern, and that is a function of orientation shown schematically there. If I move the beam to another grain, I get a different pattern because the orientation has changed. This is a single phase material at this point. And just the same process as I move the grain around, I get different diffraction patterns because I have different orientations of the crystal lattice. The hardware looks like this, mounted on an SEM. You have a camera there on the left of the column. And the camera has a phosphor screen, and inside the housing there is a camera that can be inserted and retracted from the microscope chamber. Schematically, we have a computer that controls the EBSD system so that we can move the beam to a point, and at that point collect a pattern, do some image analysis, and from that we can extract the orientation of the crystal and also other information, including the phase. We could also record EDS information as well to have information on the chemical composition. We also record various parameters telling us how good the pattern is, how well we believe we've indexed, and any other detectors in the microscope. So from this data, because we know the orientation at every point, we can reconstruct an orientation map, which tells us, can use color to represent orientation. So you see in this map here, the grains that are near red are those having 001 orientations or 001 poles parallel to the sample normal, to the surface normal. The blue ones have 111, the greens are 110s, and then everything else is somewhere in between that. And we know the orientation, not just the poles. So while I'm showing the color map in this case just shows the crystal direction parallel to the sample normal, we also know the in-plane orientation, and we know those fairly precisely down to a tenth of a degree, or somewhere between a tenth and a half a degree. Because we know the orientation at each point, we also know the misorientation at the grain boundary, so we can represent the grain boundary orientations or misorientations, as you see here, the red ones being very high angle, the blue ones being lower angle misorientations. So from these maps and from the patterns themselves, what can we learn about grain size and grain shape? And for this, I'm going to use an example, this little schematic here. You can see that there's a grain in red there, and all the orientations are nearly the same. And same for the green, the cyan, the yellow, the blue, and the orange. So instead of using image intensities to decide where grains are, we are going to use measured orientations as measured from EBSD. And you can see this can be a little bit different, but it is quite quantitative. So in this case, we have the microstructure there in the top left. You can see the image intensities. You can see where the grain boundaries are fairly clearly delineated in this sample. But what you'll notice is if I set a tolerance of 10 degrees for my orientation similarity, then you can see it's really dominated by 3 grains. So what we have in this image are actually subgrains. If you go to 1 degree, you can see even the tan grain still has a lot of subgrains we haven't picked up. If we go to ½ degree, and we start to pick up a few more, but you can see there are still additional ones that are even lower misorientations. And that has to do probably with, in this case, with residual strain and the fragmentation of grains into subgrains, which I'll come back to. The point being that we can reconstruct the grains from the orientation measurements, as you can see in this image here. The image at left is what we call a image quality or pattern quality map. So a light point or high intensity point in this image has a high quality pattern that it's produced, whereas the dark ones are low patterns or even no pattern at all in some voids. And then we know the orientation. You can see that these grains are not nice, simple, homogeneous shapes. They're quite, have tortuous boundaries, and it can be difficult to reconstruct what a grain really looks like. And that's especially apparent as we go into 3 dimensions. And this is work from David Roenhorst. He's done 308 serial sections. David does some terrific work using a robot to enable him to polish off controlled thicknesses. And so then he can slice through the microstructure and then reconstruct it. And as you can see here. And then what's really interesting is if we go to the 3-dimension and we can reconstruct the grains from the orientation measurements, you can see these are quite unusually shaped grains, much larger than what you might suspect from just simple 2D cross sections. In fact, the yellow grain you see there is quite large and covers a lot of area and a lot of volume. And what you'll notice is that in this sample, the preferred growth direction is 001. And so you get these branches and they tend to follow 001 crystal directions. And that's why you get these very odd shaped grains. So what can EBSD tell us about residual strain and stress in our material, which can be a big deal in additive manufactured materials? So first off, we need to understand what we can measure with EBSD. And so let's first start with dislocation. So there's really 2 types of dislocations we think about when we think about EBSD. So there's local perturbations, but they kind of cancel each other out in a sense. Whereas there's local misorientations, such as at a subgrain boundary, and those we can see quite well with EBSD, because what EBSD can measure are misorientations. So if we have 2 dislocations canceling each other out, we won't pick that up in EBSD so well, but we can collect, say, subgrain boundaries. And you can see that here, coming back to the idea of local dislocation or local perturbations, the dislocation density could be significant, but we end up with a net Burgers vector of 0, and so we don't end up with a misorientation. And so the effect will be that we will have a more diffuse pattern, but we won't see a change in orientation. So we can see it both in terms of the IQ values, but we can't see it in terms of misorientations. And the IQ values tend to be difficult to quantify in a useful way, and we like to focus on misorientations. So think about a non-zero net Burgers vector, and we call these geometrically necessary dislocations like we would see at a grain boundary or a subgrain boundary. And we can measure these. We can see these in the patterns. You can see there in this example, these are, I've done 4 degrees so that they're a little more apparent, but you can see both the red, green, and blue areas all produce patterns that are slightly different from each other, and we can detect that with EBSD. So we have different ways of looking at this data and characterizing it into images that to help us better understand our microstructure. One is the so-called KAM, the kernel average misorientation map. And what we're going to do is take our data here is collected on a hexagonal grid, and we're going to take the misorientation between a point and its neighbors, or maybe second nearest neighbors. That is up to the user to define. And so what you see is the blue grains that you see there have very low KAM values, and that's because they're recrystallized grains, whereas the other grains surrounding them are deformed material, and you can start to see the subgrain boundaries start to appear within those grains. Another way of looking at it is something we call a grain reference orientation deviation map. And in this, we take a grain, we calculate the average orientation for a grain, and then we calculate the deviation of each point within the grain from that average orientation. And so now we color each point in the grain according to that deviation, as you can see there. So the red points being points that are a long ways away from the average, the blue being very near the average. Repeat the process for each grain in the data set. So here's some example. Here's our standard orientation maps, and you can see there's subtle changes in color, but pretty fine. It's tough to see it. This is an in situ tensile specimen in a low carbon steel, and you see slight changes in orientation at different steps in terms of the deformation. More often you see a change in image quality, and that's because we're getting contamination as we continue to scan the same area over and over again. Now, if we look at the kernel average misorientation, we don't see a lot, even out to 10%, until we go out to, say, in this case, the fifth nearest neighbors, the fifth order KAM, if you will. And this is a half micron step, and you do see then that we're getting some increased residual strain in our material, as evidenced by the increasing KAM values. If we look at the GROD maps, or grain reference orientation deviation maps, then you can get an idea of what's happening within individual grains, and you can see that the grains are starting to fragment, to deviate from the original orientation, and the average, the orientation within the grains is also wandering. Now, that can be useful, but there's been other work to look at elastic stress and strain in the material. So here's an example, stressed extremely, so just so that we can see it. It's 11% strain in the horizontal direction, and you can see the effect on the diffraction pattern. Not only is there a slight rotation that you see, but more importantly, what you see is, because you have a distortion of the crystal lattice, you actually see the poles shifting from their regular positions. And we have ways of measuring this, most notably that work done by Wilkinson and others, looking at very small shifts, sub-pixel shifts of the poles, the zone axes within the patterns. And this is done using cross-correlation of individual regions of interest. And I just show a few here. Usually they're quite a bit larger, covering a lot and overlapping. But you're able to get a whole series of these displacements within the pattern. And from that, then you can reconstruct a displacement gradient tensor. And you can do that actually for each ROI, but then combine them together into one, and then start to look at the elastic parts of that tensor and the plastic parts. And so you can measure, start to measure the elastic strain, and from that derive the elastic stress. It's a relative measure because you have to have a strain-free pattern or compare two patterns and see what the difference is between the two to get an idea of the stress and strain within the material. Although work is going on using simulated patterns as well to try to extend this method. So here's an example from the BLG website, who do the cross-correlation work, and as well as others. But here's just an example showing you can measure the normal strains, the shear strains, as well as the plastic rotation, which we'd already talked about. Now, how does this affect what we're looking at? Here's just a simple example of a sample from powder bed diffusion, and just showing, we'll look at the stress and strain that develops during the process. So here's some TEM analysis. So we have bright field images, and you can see the dense dislocation networks that form the cell structures, and you can even see that at both at the high and the lower resolution. And as we approach the SEM resolution, you can kind of see those same cells in the IQ map quite well. It's hard to see much in the orientation maps, but let's use the quantitative data to try to, the cross-correlation data to pull that out. And this is work of Josh Kasher at Georgia Tech and his colleagues. So here's a scan that we've done on this material. It's additive manufactured 316 stainless. And these measurements were completed using a direct electron detector that EDAX has been working on. We're trying to start to look at using direct electron detectors for EBSD. And the defect structures are weakly apparent here, but can't really pick them out very well. So let's take a look at the cross correlation at the subpixel level. Here's the regular KAM analysis on the left, and then here is the cross correlation method on the right. You can see that the cell walls are stronger, and there's not as much going on within the subgrains as maybe we would have thought from the general EBSD KAM measurements, where we have quite a bit more, or we have less resolution in terms of the orientation, or misorientations really. From that, we can also calculate the GNDs quite well, the geometrically necessarily dislocation density. And this is pretty quick. We did this in the scan in about 20 minutes. But we can actually get some quantitative numbers now on the GND density. And you can see it's concentrated into dislocation cell walls. The blue you see there are grain boundaries themselves. And then from that, we can also look at the elastic strain. This is the 1,3 shear strain in this case. And you can then plot that, as you can see along that line scan across, and see how strong those cell walls really are. And this information obviously can help us better understand our AM materials and how they develop during processing, and also help us understand, better predict the mechanical properties. So what else can we learn out of a material, and especially in terms of phases? So this is a nice sample of Ti-64 that we received. It's an implant device, and we took a look at it. We got very good indexing rate on it, and we've used different step sizes to try and scale and look at the microstructure. And we've also done full EDS spectral characterization at each point within the map, but I won't focus on that much. So when you look at this microstructure, it certainly looks like something that's undergone a phase transformation, where the grains in the parent phase have transformed into different crystallographic variants of the child phase, which forms the lamellar or Widmanstätten structure. So we thought we would look at that in more detail. There is some retained beta phase in the material. It wasn't totally obvious from that initial picture, but we detected about a 2% of the beta phase. As we go to smaller step sizes, we do pick up more beta phase, so there is a resolution kind of requirement here that we have to meet to catch it. And so we're going to take a look at the beta phase in more detail. You can see, if you look at the orientations, you can see what appear to be prior grains of the parent phase. You can kind of get some idea of their outline from looking at the retained beta. Now, if we assume an orientation relationship of the 110 in the beta phase being parallel to the 0001 in the alpha phase, and the 111 planes or directions being parallel to the 112 bar directions, then we can reconstruct what we think the parent grains look like. And you'll see the reconstruction isn't perfectly clean. We still see some variants that haven't been connected together into grains, but we do get a nice idea of the initial grain size and the initial orientations by using this reconstruction method. In this case, I'm using a method by Ranger and others at CMU, and actually there's quite a few contributors here. So if we look now at the retained beta and our reconstructed, you do see the colors match up, which confirms that we've done a reasonable job of reconstructing what the parent grain orientations were. You'll notice one thing initially is that kind of pink to purple grain, just to the right of middle, the large one there, has quite a variation in color from pink to purple, indicating that it has a relatively strong change in orientation. And this indicates then strain, and so that's why we're having some difficulty in the reconstructed, because the orientations are wandering so much, and we're trying to use that orientation information to reconstruct grains. So we're looking for matches and things like that, and since we're deviating from that, that's why we're not capturing it perfectly. But you'll do notice that we do know something now about the beta phase that I assume, must be forming initially during the additive manufacturing process and then changing, transforming into the structure, to the alpha structure that we see after the processing. So as material scientists, we like this triangle of trying to link properties, processing, and microstructure together. This is kind of what we do. And so we can use, the nice thing about additive manufacturing is we have more control over the microstructure than we've ever had before. And this then allows us to better understand the effect of processing on properties. As an example, here's a metallic foam that was done by Ashley Spear's group at University of Utah. It's laser powder bed diffusion. And you can see that on the left is the investment cast material, and then on the right is the additive manufactured material. Very different microstructures, even though the foam itself looks almost the same. If we then go ahead and try to compress the foam, you'll see this nice example from the paper. And you can see that the additive manufactured material is a little bit more brittle. You can see it definitely deforms differently than we'd get from the conventional investment casting. And so this is a very nice example of how the microstructure affects the properties. So can we use this to our advantage? Having been a student of Brent Adams, he was always very interested in microstructure sensitive design for optimizing performance, particularly in terms of anisotropy. And we can do things that with additive manufacturing, we can never do before. Here's a great example from Oak Ridge National Lab, where they went and changed the processing to write out DOE. And so the colors you see there are different grain orientations. So this will affect the properties locally within the red material versus the blue and the green, as you might expect. So if we can control the microstructure like this, then maybe we can engineer the microstructure to meet the properties needs of a particular component. So just as an example, if think about something like the elastic modulus, you can see there for 4 different grains, the elastic modulus is reflective of the orientation of the crystal, and you can see that it's quite a bit different. If we average it all out, then we get a bulk modulus, in this case, that's pretty close to random, although it is elongated in the normal direction that you see there. And so can we use this then to create a microstructure that we want? So as an example, here's a cantilever beam undergoing a loading there at the end. And Suri Kaladindi's group looked at this specific problem and constructed what's called a microstructural hole. And so from that, you can find the best solution and the worst solution to, in this case, try to reduce the deflection based on the average elastic compliance tensors. And you can see there's a worse solution, there's the isotropic solution, and there's a best solution for this specific problem. And you can see the textures that lead to the worst and the best solution are quite different. And so the goal would be to use this process first to identify the texture desired, and then use something like additive manufacturing to try and meet that microstructural criterion, or in this case, just the texture criterion, to lead to optimized performance. And I don't think we've reached that goal, but I think there are some neat ideas. This is just a selective laser melting of a Haynes 282 nickel alloy, and you can see that the microstructure and the resulting texture, which is a function of the microstructure. And so that would be the goal we'd love to realize. So in summary, I hope I've been able to show that EBSD can be used to characterize the microstructure of additively manufactured metals, as well as other materials, but we focused on metals. EBSD helps us better understand the link between microstructure, processing, and properties. And I hope that information will eventually lead us to optimizing performance, and especially in terms of anisotropy, whether it be local or for the bulk material, to meet specific performance needs for components that we are constructing. And with that, I will close, and thanks for your attention.